Okay, so picture this. Your party just lost a big election. It's a tough moment, right? And you're at a crossroads. Do you look in the mirror and figure out what went wrong? Or do you look for someone else to blame? Today, we're diving into a really interesting editorial that unpacks this exact situation after the Bihar Assembly elections. It gets to a huge question about how democracies are supposed to work, especially when things don't go your way.
And yeah, that's really the heart of it all. When the votes are in and you've lost, who gets the blame? It seems like a simple question, but it's the one that kicked off a massive political firestorm here, with an entire opposition alliance taking aim at one of the most fundamental institutions in Indian democracy. All right, so let's set the scene. We're talking about Bihar, just after the big assembly elections. And for the opposition, well, the results were a major letdown. But what's really interesting is that their first move wasn't to huddle up and rethink their strategy. Nope, it was to question the entire election result.
And, just look at this chart. It really shows you just how big of a defeat we're talking about. The Mahagatbandhan alliance, the main opposition group, had what the analysis calls a disastrous performance. You can see the numbers for yourself. It was a clear, decisive win for the other side, the NDA. But as you can probably guess, that's not where the story ends.
So instead of just taking the loss, the opposition dropped a bombshell. They basically said, hey, we didn't lose because of the voters. They claimed it was a conspiracy, a collusion between the ruling party and the Election Commission of India. You know, the ECI, the very organization whose entire job is to make sure elections are free and fair.
So, you gotta ask, where did these allegations come from? This wasn't just some vague, sour grapes complaint. The opposition was pointing to very specific things, actions and, inconsistencies from the Election Commission that they said tipped the scales. So, let's dig into what their argument actually was.
Okay, so the core of the whole controversy comes down to this thing called the Special Intensive Revision, or SIR for short. Now, this is a totally normal procedure the ECI does to clean up the voter lists. Add new voters, remove people who've moved away or died. Pretty standard stuff. But the opposition's claim was that this routine process was actually weaponized against them to deliberately take their supporters off the voter rolls.
And this quote really drives home just how serious their accusation was. They weren't just saying, oh, there were a few mistakes. No, they were alleging what the analysis calls a concerted attempt to dispossess specific groups of their franchise. Let that sink in. They were basically saying this was a planned campaign to steal the election by just erasing voters.
Now, what gave this whole accusation some legs was the ECI's own recent history. Check this out. In the Bihar election, the ECI said it was totally fine for the ruling party to keep making cash transfers from a welfare program. But just a year before, in Rajasthan, they blocked the government there from doing the exact same thing. So when you see that kind of inconsistency, it's easy to see why it fueled this idea of bias. It made a lot of people wonder, wait a minute, is the referee really impartial here?
Okay, so the opposition has laid out its case, right? They're pointing at the voter list revisions and the ECI's inconsistent rulings. But the editorial we're looking at, it pushes back. It suggests that maybe, just maybe, this whole blame game is a way to avoid looking at some much harder truths. So let's see what evidence it brings to the table.
And here's the big counterpoint from the analysis. For all the serious allegations, there's just no verifiable, hard evidence to prove them. There's no data, no paper trail that shows the voters who were removed from the lists were mainly supporters of the opposition. So you have a lot of suspicion, for sure, but the actual proof, it just isn't there.
And this is where it gets really interesting. The opposition actually went on a whole campaign tour, the Voter Adhikar Yatra, focused specifically on this issue of voter deletions. So you'd think, naturally, they'd do really well in those areas, right? Well, they didn't. They performed just as poorly there as they did everywhere else. And that kind of suggests that for the average voter, this just wasn't the big issue the opposition thought it was.
So if the election wasn't rigged, what actually happened? Well, the editorial lays out a bunch of other very plausible reasons. For one, a whole lot more women turned out to vote, and they might have leaned towards the ruling party. Then you have the impact of those welfare schemes and cash transfers we talked about. There were also shifts in caste coalitions, and frankly, the NDA just had a stronger get-out-the-vote operation. And, a big one, the opposition never really managed to shake that jungle Raj narrative, that old story about lawlessness when they were in power, and that likely scared off a lot of voters.
And all of this brings us right back to the central theme of the editorial. It's about the choice a party has to make after a big loss. It's like a fork in the road. Do you go down the path of blaming everyone else,
Or do you take the harder path of turning that microscope inward? That's the real conflict here. Blame versus introspection. And you can see the two paths laid out right here. The blame route, sure, it might feel good for a little while, but it chips away at public trust in the whole system. And more importantly, it means the party never has to fix its own problems. The other path, introspection, is way harder, no doubt, but that's the one that actually helps you figure out where you went wrong, make real changes, and come back stronger next time.
Ultimately, the editorial's conclusion is that the blame strategy is just a dead end. I mean, the quote says it all. Blaming the ECI to avoid introspection can be self-defeating for the Congress. It's like you get a short-term win by deflecting the issue, but in the long run, you're hurting not just your own party, but the entire democratic system you're a part of.
Okay, so if pointing fingers is the wrong way to go, what's the right way? How do you actually move forward and start to rebuild trust in the whole process? Not just for the parties, but for everyone. Well, the analysis suggests it's not a one-person job. It's going to take a few different groups working together.
Yeah, it's all about shared responsibility. So, step one is for the opposition parties. Do the grunt work. Run a real, data-driven audit of what happened and learn how to talk about these issues in a way that connects with people's actual lives. Step two is on the ECI. They need to be way more transparent. Just publish all the detailed booth-by-booth data on who's being added and removed from voter lists. Put it all out there. And finally, step three, for civil society groups, take that public data, turnout numbers, deletion lists, and run your own independent audits to act as a watchdog.
And that really leaves us with a big final question, doesn't it? In a democracy, where does the responsibility for trust really begin? Does it all fall on the institutions to be perfect? Or do political parties and even us, as citizens, have a responsibility to be critical, sure, but also constructive, especially when our side loses? Maybe trust isn't just something you get. Maybe it's something everyone has to work together to build and to keep.